Hello, dear viewers. Welcome back to the Grave of the Shadows. Before we begin today's story, I'd like to thank you for your continued support. If you enjoy this tale, please consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell. Now let's dim the lights and dive into tonight's chilling account. It was supposed to be a peaceful investment. A charming, old estate nestled in the countryside, a piece of history waiting to be revived. The Maddox Heirs were eager to sell, and I was eager to buy. What could go wrong? But the moment I stepped onto the property, I felt something off. The house loomed in front of me, its ivy-clad walls and creaking shutters hinting at a long-forgotten past. It was as if the mansion was holding its breath, waiting for someone to ask the questions that had been left unspoken for decades. The heirs were oddly silent about the house's history, avoiding any mention of the family's legacy or the strange things said to happen in the mansion. I thought it was just rumors. Stories passed down through the generations, exaggerated over time. But then, I found something. It wasn't in the walls or beneath the floorboards, but in the Maddox family records. A note, a small detail about a payment made long ago to ensure the family forgot the darkest parts of their history. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that the Maddox family had been hiding something much darker than a few forgotten heirlooms. Something tied to the very property I had just purchased. What they paid to forget, and what I was about to uncover, would change everything. The mansion stood on the outskirts of the small town, nestled between overgrown trees and a winding dirt road that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. The air felt different here, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. It was a place that felt lost in time, untouched by the outside world, and yet, there was an overwhelming sense of history, not the kind you read about in books, but the kind you feel in your bones. The kind that lingers long after the pages have turned. As I pulled up the gravel driveway, the house seemed to grow taller, looming above me like a shadow that refused to be ignored. Its tall windows stared down at me, as if the house itself were watching, waiting for something, or someone, to come. The ivy that had crawled up the stone walls gave the house a haunting, almost abandoned appearance. The once beautiful gardens had long since been overtaken by wild grass, and the fountain in the center of the courtyard was dry and cracked, its water no longer flowing. There was a certain eeriness to the place, a stillness that made the air feel heavy. The wind rustled through the trees, sending leaves tumbling to the ground in soft whispers. The house seemed to hold its breath, as if it had been waiting for me all along. And as I walked toward the front door, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something hidden just beyond the reach of my understanding. The door creaked open, its ancient hinges protesting with a groan that echoed through the empty hall. I stepped inside, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet that lined the floor. The foyer was dim, the only light coming from a chandelier overhead that was covered in dust. The air inside smelled stale, as though it had been locked away for years, unused and untouched. It was as if time had stood still within these walls, holding the house in a state of suspended animation. The walls were lined with portraits of long-dead ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow me as I moved through the room. The grand staircase led up to the second floor, where shadows danced along the walls. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I gazed at the darkened hallway above. The house had a way of making everything seem larger, more significant. It was as if the past had seeped into the very fabric of the place, leaving behind traces of forgotten stories and untold secrets. I made my way deeper into the house, each room more unsettling than the last. The parlor was filled with antique furniture covered in white sheets, as though the house had been abandoned at a moment's notice. In the dining room, a large chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals reflecting the faint light that filtered through the dust-covered windows. The air felt thick in these rooms, heavy with the weight of time and silence. The walls seemed to hum with a strange energy, as though they were trying to keep something contained. But the longer I stayed, the more I realized that whatever was being kept hidden in this house, whatever the Maddox family had left behind, wasn't going to stay buried forever. There was a door at the end of the hallway, a small, wooden door that looked out of place amid the grandeur of the house. It was old, its edges chipped and worn, and it seemed to beckon me toward it, as if it had been waiting for me to discover it. I reached for the handle, but something stopped me. A voice, faint and distant, echoed in my mind, warning me to stay away. I hesitated, my hand frozen just above the doorknob. The house felt colder here, the shadows growing deeper and more oppressive. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps upstairs, slow and deliberate, but when I looked up, the staircase was empty. My heart began to race as I stood there, caught between the pull of curiosity and the instinct to run. But before I could move, the door creaked open, as though something or someone inside had been waiting for me. And that's when I knew I had stepped into a history far darker than I had ever imagined. The Maddox family hadn't just left secrets behind. They had left something far more dangerous. And now, it was my turn to confront it. As I walked deeper into the mansion, the unease in my chest grew. The walls, lined with old portraits and antique furniture, seemed to close in on me, their presence heavy and unwelcoming. Every creak of the wooden floors beneath my feet, every flicker of the dim lights above, added to the growing sense of being watched. It wasn't just the physical space of the house that felt oppressive, it was something intangible, something that lingered in the air like a whisper, just beyond my understanding. I tried to shake off the feeling, convincing myself it was simply the house's age, its decay. It was a relic, after all. But there was something more to it, something that went beyond the dusty furniture and the flickering lights. It was the way the house seemed to respond to my presence, as though it were aware of me, watching me, waiting for me to uncover something it was desperate to keep hidden. The first clue came a few days after I had settled in. I was walking through the grand hallway when I noticed something odd. The portraits that lined the walls, portraits of the Maddox family, their ancestors, seemed to be different. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. But when I looked closer, I saw it. The eyes of the figures in the portraits were not as still as they had been. They were following me. I laughed it off at first, chalking it up to the play of light and shadow, the tricks the mind can play when surrounded by the strange quiet of an old house. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the portraits were watching me. The longer I stayed in the house, the more I noticed these little details. The whispers in the air, the cold drafts that seemed to appear from nowhere, the soft thumps that echoed through the walls late at night. The house was never truly still. It wasn't until I found the old diary that things began to make sense, or perhaps, that they began to get even more complicated. The diary belonged to Geraldine Maddox, the family matriarch, and its leather cover was so worn that it seemed to be on the verge of crumbling. I had stumbled upon it while searching the study for any old documents or records about the property. The entries were brief but chilling. They described her growing concern for the family's legacy and the strange happenings she had witnessed within the house. The deeper I read, the more I saw parallels to the strange things happening to me. The noises, the cold spots, and the feeling of being watched. Geraldine spoke of them, the twins, Theodore and Theodora Maddox, and the curse that had plagued the family for generations. But she didn't just write about them as lost souls, she described them as dangerous, uncontrollable forces that should never have been born. Her final entry sent a cold chill down my spine. We sealed them away, but I fear they are not gone. The boundary that keeps them in place grows weaker with every passing day. And soon, they will break free, unless we complete what we started. If you are reading this, you must know that the Maddox family is bound to this house, and so are the twins. The curse is real, and it's waiting. The more I read, the more I realized how much of this history had been hidden, covered up by the Maddox heirs. Geraldine had written about attempts to contain the curse, to trap the twins in the house by using ancient rituals. But it was clear that the ritual had been interrupted, and the boundaries between the living and the dead had started to blur. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, the whispers growing louder in my mind. The house was never quiet anymore. There were footsteps in the hallway. There was the sound of something, or someone, moving in the attic. The darkness seemed to stretch and deepen around me. I was no longer alone in this house. I stood up from my bed, my legs shaky from the tension in the air, and I moved toward the attic stairs. The house groaned under my feet, as though it were trying to warn me to stop. But I couldn't. I needed answers. I needed to understand the truth about what had happened here. As I approached the attic, I could hear it, soft, distant voices, like the faint murmur of children. But the attic was empty. The space was cold, the walls lined with old trunks and cobwebs. But there, in the corner, was an old wooden chest, unopened, untouched, as if it had been waiting for me. My hands trembled as I reached for the chest's lid, and as I lifted it, I knew this would be the moment when everything changed. As I opened the chest, a thick layer of dust stirred into the air, creating a faint cloud that lingered around me. Inside the chest was a collection of old papers, yellowed and fragile with age. There were no photographs, no keepsakes, just documents, their edges worn from years of neglect. The smell of mildew filled the air as I carefully began sifting through them, one by one. The first few pages were harmless enough, records of the house's construction and early ownership. But as I reached the bottom, I found something different, something far more chilling. It was a letter, written in delicate handwriting that was unmistakably familiar. It was from Geraldine Maddox, the same matriarch whose diary I had found earlier. The letter was addressed to someone named Edward Maddox, her husband, and it was dated nearly 30 years ago. The words on the page were frantic, each sentence more desperate than the last. Geraldine spoke of the twins, Theodore and Theodora, as if they were both a curse and a blessing, a part of the family but also something far darker. The letter began, "Edward, I fear I can no longer protect us from what we've created. The twins are not like other children. They are not what they appear to be. I know you think they are simply gifted, that their intelligence and abilities are a marvel, but they are far more than that. They are a force that we cannot control." I paused, my heart pounding. The words gifted and abilities echoed in my mind, but it was the next part of the letter that truly caught my attention. They see things, Edward. They know things that no child should. They speak in a language that I do not understand, and their eyes are empty, as if there is something else behind them. Something ancient. I've tried to keep them hidden, but the house feels smaller now, as though they are pushing against the walls. I fear that if we do not act soon, we will lose them forever, and in doing so, we will lose everything. My hand shook as I turned the page. This was far more than just a mother's concern for her children. This was the beginning of something terrible. Geraldine's fear was palpable, and the weight of it seemed to hang in the air around me, even now. The letter continued, "The ritual, Edward. It must be completed. We must bind them, or else they will escape, and we will be left to face whatever it is they have become. I've already contacted the others, but they are unwilling to help. They do not believe me. But you and I both know the truth. The twins were never meant to be. Their birth was the result of something darker, something beyond our understanding. We must act before it's too late." I set the letter down, my mind reeling. The ritual Geraldine referred to was the same one mentioned in the journal I had read earlier. The one that was meant to contain the curse, to lock the twins away and keep them from breaking free. But what had gone wrong? Why had the ritual been interrupted? And what exactly were the twins? Were they even human? As I sat there in the attic, surrounded by the remnants of the past, a sudden noise startled me. The floorboards creaked in the distance, a low groan that seemed to echo through the entire house. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. My heart skipped a beat, and I stood up quickly, my pulse racing. No one was supposed to be here. No one but me. I had locked the front door, and there was no way anyone could have entered without me noticing. The footsteps stopped just outside the attic door. I held my breath, straining to hear. The house was silent again. I reached for the flashlight on the nearby shelf and turned it on, my hands shaking as the beam of light cut through the darkness. As I slowly approached the attic door, the air seemed to thicken, as though the house was pressing against me. The light flickered, casting long shadows across the wooden beams. I hesitated, my mind racing. Who, or what, was standing just on the other side of that door? Was it a member of the Maddox family? Or was it something else? Something far worse? With a deep breath, I opened the door. But there was nothing there. The hallway was empty, as it had been before. My pulse slowly began to return to normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something was waiting. The door closed with a soft click, and I stood there for a moment, listening for any sound, but there was none. I turned back to the chest, but the letter and papers felt even heavier now, as if the weight of the truth had settled upon them. The curse was real. The twins were not just children. They were something darker, something bound to the very house I had bought. And now, it seemed, it was too late to escape. The house would never let me leave. The feeling of being watched never left me. In the days following my discovery of the Maddox family's secrets, the house began to feel more like a trap, a snare that had been set long ago, and now, it was slowly closing around me. The faintest sound in the night, the creak of floorboards, the whisper of wind through the cracks in the walls, they all felt like warnings, as if the house itself were trying to communicate something to me. But what was it trying to say? What was hidden behind the walls of this mansion? The strange events escalated. The footsteps, which I had originally dismissed as a trick of the house's age, grew more frequent, more deliberate. At first, they were confined to the upstairs hallway, but soon, they began to echo through the entire house, moving from room to room, as if whatever it was following me. Sometimes, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, feeling a heavy presence in the room. My breath would catch in my throat, and I'd sit there, staring into the darkness, waiting for something, or someone, to make itself known. Then came the sounds. Faint whispers, barely audible, drifting through the hallways. The voices were indistinguishable, but their tone was unmistakable. They weren't comforting. They were cold, detached, like echoes from another time. And they were growing louder. I found myself straining to listen, to understand what they were saying, but the words were always just out of reach. I began to have vivid dreams, or were they memories? The lines blurred. I would dream of the twins, Theodore and Theodora, playing in the garden outside the mansion, laughing with an innocence that seemed too perfect to be true. Their laughter was joyful, but there was something off about it. It felt too forced, like they were trying to hide something darker beneath the surface. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, but the image of them would stay with me, clinging to the edges of my mind. Then, one evening, I returned to the mansion after a long day of trying to piece together more of the Maddox family's past. As I entered the hallway, I noticed something strange. The portraits of the Maddox ancestors that lined the walls, the ones that had once seemed so lifeless, were now different. The eyes of the figures, once dull and unmoving, were following me. I paused, my heart hammering in my chest. No, it couldn't be. I had to be imagining things. But as I walked past, I swore I saw one of the figures shift, just for a second. It was subtle, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. I walked quickly down the hallway, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. But it didn't help. The house had become a labyrinth of shadows and whispers, and I felt like I was being guided down a path I couldn't control. Every step I took seemed to echo in the emptiness, and the deeper I went, the more I felt like something was lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. It wasn't long before I started hearing the children's laughter again, this time from the attic. It was a haunting sound, full of joy yet empty, as though the laughter didn't belong to the children but to something else entirely. I hesitated at the bottom of the stairs leading up to the attic. I knew I had to face whatever was up there, but I wasn't ready. Still, the urge to uncover the truth pulled at me, urging me to climb those stairs, to open that door. With a deep breath, I ascended the narrow staircase, my footsteps creaking loudly against the silence. As I reached the attic door, I felt an intense chill fill the air. The temperature had dropped dramatically, and my breath came out in visible puffs of fog. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob. There was no turning back now. The door creaked open, and the smell of mildew and dust hit me instantly. The attic was even colder than the rest of the house. Shadows clung to every corner, and the light from my flashlight barely cut through the darkness. I stepped inside, my footsteps muffled on the thick carpet of dust beneath me. At first, I saw nothing unusual. The attic was filled with old boxes, furniture covered in sheets, and piles of discarded belongings. But then I saw it, a large mirror, leaning against the wall, covered in a layer of dust. I hadn't noticed it before. As I walked closer, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was something strange about it, something that made my pulse quicken. The mirror seemed to reflect nothing at first. It was as if it was empty, but then, slowly, the image began to form. The twins appeared in the reflection, standing just behind me. Their faces were twisted in expressions of joy, but their eyes were completely empty. No pupils, no emotion, just dark, hollow voids staring back at me. I froze, unable to move as the image of the twins stared at me, their laughter echoing in the silence. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the reflection vanished, leaving nothing but the cold, lifeless glass. The mirror's reflection vanished as quickly as it had appeared, but the eerie sensation lingered. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I stood frozen, staring at the empty glass. The laughter of the twins, so joyful yet sinister, echoed in my ears, reverberating through the attic like a warning. The shadows in the room seemed to close in around me, darkening the edges of my vision. I couldn't move. The weight of the air in the room was too much. It felt as if something unseen was pressing down on me, urging me to stay, to confront whatever force had been lurking in this house for so long. Every inch of my body screamed for me to turn and run, to leave this cursed place behind. But I knew I couldn't. The Maddox family's secrets were bound to this house, and I had already uncovered too much. I had to finish what I had started. I had to understand why the house had become a prison, why the twins were trapped in this eternal cycle of torment. The house creaked beneath my feet as I stepped away from the mirror, my eyes scanning the dimly lit attic for any sign of movement. I could still hear the faint sound of footsteps behind me, though I knew I was alone. Or at least, I thought I was. I turned back toward the center of the room, my flashlight flickering in my hand. The shadows seemed to stretch longer now, as if they were reaching for me. I could feel the pull, like invisible fingers curling around my neck, guiding me toward the farthest corner of the attic. My feet moved on their own, carrying me to a small, forgotten door at the back. I hadn't noticed it before, it was hidden behind a stack of old boxes, its frame worn and weathered. With trembling hands, I opened the door. It led to a narrow staircase that descended into the darkness below. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and I hesitated. My instincts told me to turn back, but the lure of the unknown was stronger. The house was pulling me deeper into its secrets. There was no going back now. I descended the stairs slowly, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. The darkness around me seemed to grow thicker with each step, suffocating and cold. The flashlight flickered once more before going completely dark, leaving me in a suffocating blackness. I fumbled for the spare batteries in my pocket, but as I did, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind me. Slow. Deliberate. Unmistakable. I spun around, but no one was there. I was alone. Or at least, I thought I was. But then, in the faint light of the flashlight, I saw them. The twins. Theodore and Theodora, standing at the bottom of the stairs. Their faces were pale and expressionless, their eyes still empty, but there was something else, a presence, something dark and ancient that seemed to radiate from them. Their shadows stretched across the floor, twisting and contorting as if they were alive. The air grew colder, and the temperature dropped so quickly that I could see my breath. A voice, soft and whispering, echoed through the space. It was the twins, but their voices were not their own. They sounded distant, alien, like something that had been trapped in the house for far too long. "Leave," they whispered in unison, their voices overlapping. "You do not belong here." But I couldn't leave. I couldn't turn back now. The curse had been passed down through generations, and I had uncovered the truth. The twins had never been meant to live in this world. They were part of something darker, something more ancient, and they were bound to the house by a force I couldn't begin to comprehend. With a surge of adrenaline, I took a step toward them. The twins remained motionless, their eyes never leaving mine. The shadows around them seemed to thicken, wrapping around their bodies like a cloak of darkness. The voice whispered again, this time more forcefully, more commanding. "Leave this place," it urged. "You cannot undo what has been done." I took another step, the air thickening around me, pressing against my chest. I was suffocating, but I couldn't stop now. The ritual was the only way. I had to perform it. I had to complete the family's legacy and end the curse that had tormented this house for generations. The twins stepped back, their feet barely making a sound on the old wooden floor. I moved forward, my body trembling, but I knew what I had to do. I couldn't let them stop me. The ritual would break the curse once and for all, but only if I acted quickly. As I reached the center of the room, I began to draw the ancient symbols on the floor, just as the grimoire had instructed. My hands shook as I traced the lines, the markings glowing faintly in the dim light. The twins watched me silently, their cold eyes never leaving my face. The room was thick with the energy of the curse, the presence of something far older than the house itself. I whispered the incantation, my voice barely audible over the growing noise in the room. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the temperature continued to plummet. The twins' shadows grew longer, their forms stretching across the walls like monstrous figures. The house groaned, as if it were alive and struggling to keep the curse intact. I repeated the incantation, louder now, my voice echoing through the room. The air pulsed with energy, and I felt a sudden rush of warmth flood through me, as if the very essence of the house was being drawn into the ritual. The twins began to scream, their voices rising in agony, but I held my ground, finishing the final line of the ritual. With a final, deafening crack, the curse was broken. The room went silent. The silence in the room was deafening. It was as if the very air had been sucked out, leaving me alone in the stillness of a house that no longer seemed alive with the same energy. The warmth that had flooded me during the ritual began to fade, leaving behind an eerie calm that felt almost unnatural. I stood there for a moment, my hands trembling from the exertion of the ritual, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I waited for something, anything, to happen. The twins were no longer in front of me. The shadows that had once stretched across the floor seemed to have dissipated, leaving only the faint outline of their presence in the dust and cobwebs. It was as if they had never been there at all, their dark energy fading into the atmosphere of the room. The house, once oppressive and heavy, now felt strangely lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from its walls. But as I took a tentative step forward, a chilling thought crossed my mind. Was it truly over? Had I broken the curse, or had I merely bought myself more time? The ritual had worked, I was certain of that. The oppressive force that had once suffocated me was gone, but I couldn't help but feel that something still lingered, something unfinished. The house was quiet, but it wasn't empty. I looked around the room, my eyes drawn to the symbols I had etched on the floor. They were still glowing faintly, the lines pulsing with a faint, rhythmic energy. It was as though the house was still holding onto its secrets, reluctant to let go completely. I walked toward the center of the room, my feet hesitant, unsure of the next step. The ritual had worked, but it was clear that the curse wasn't just something that could be easily erased. It was part of the house, part of the land itself. And as much as I wanted to walk away, to leave the Maddox family's dark past behind, I knew that the house was bound to me now, just as much as I was bound to it. Suddenly, the air shifted. A faint sound, like the fluttering of wings, caught my attention. I turned quickly, my heart leaping in my chest. But there was nothing there. The room was still. The attic, the staircase, the walls, they were all quiet, as though they were holding their breath. And then, I heard it. A voice, faint but unmistakable, calling my name. Eliza. It was a whisper, carried on the wind, but it sounded so real, so close. My heart skipped a beat as I turned toward the source of the sound, but the room was still empty. The voice repeated itself, this time clearer, more insistent. Eliza. I took a step back, my pulse quickening. Was it the twins? Or was it something else, something even darker than the curse I had just broken? I had hoped that completing the ritual would have put an end to everything, that the house would return to normal, but now I wasn't so sure. The voice wasn't the same as the whispers I had heard earlier. It was familiar, comforting, even. But why was it calling me? I reached out for the doorframe to steady myself, the wood cold beneath my fingers. My mind raced, but I couldn't focus on anything. The house was still, but it was not at peace. The secrets of the Maddox family had been buried for a reason, and as much as I wanted to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something left to discover. I closed my eyes, drawing in a deep breath, and for the first time since I had stepped into the house, I felt a presence, a warmth, a familiarity. It was as though the house itself was trying to tell me something. I knew then that I had not fully completed the ritual. There was still one final step, one last truth to uncover. I stepped back into the room, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The air seemed to shift again, the atmosphere thickening as I began to search. I examined the walls, the floor, every nook and cranny, looking for the one last piece of the puzzle. And then, there it was, a small, hidden compartment in the wall, barely noticeable unless you knew where to look. I pulled it open, my hands trembling, and inside, I found an old, weathered box. It was smaller than I had expected, but it was heavy, as though it contained something far more valuable than its size suggested. I opened the box, and inside, I found a set of keys, several small, rusted keys, each one marked with the same strange symbols that had been part of the ritual. These were not just ordinary keys. They were the final pieces of the Maddox curse. The keys that had once locked the family away, bound them to this house, to this land. And now, they were mine. They were the key to completing the ritual, to truly ending the Maddox legacy. With a deep breath, I held the keys in my hand. I knew what I had to do. The final step was not about breaking the curse. It was about releasing it, allowing it to pass from the house, from the land, and into the history books where it belonged. I walked toward the attic once more, the keys heavy in my palm. The house seemed to hold its breath as I stood in front of the attic door. The final ritual was about to be completed. The Maddox family's dark history would finally be put to rest. But as I placed the first key into the lock, I knew that this wasn't just the end of their story. It was the end of mine, too. The silence that followed the completion of the ritual was unlike anything I had ever experienced. The house, which had once felt so alive with shadows and whispers, now seemed to be holding its breath in a way that was almost reverent. The walls, once burdened with the weight of secrets, now felt clearer, as though the curse had truly been lifted, and for the first time, the house was simply still. I stood there, in the dim light of the attic, holding the keys in my hand, feeling the faint pulse of the house's remaining energy. It was as though the air itself had been altered, no longer filled with fear, but with a sense of finality. The Maddox family's curse had been broken, their legacy untangled from the roots of this mansion, but something still lingered. The feeling that, even in their absence, the Maddox legacy had shaped me as much as it had shaped the house. The twins, Theodore and Theodora, were no longer trapped here, but the house would always remember them. And now, so would I. As I walked through the mansion one final time, the house felt different, lighter, emptier. The oppressive weight of its history seemed to have faded, and yet, the memories remained. The voices in the walls, the shadows in the corners, they were all still there, just beneath the surface, waiting for the next person to come and uncover them. It had been my turn, but soon, it would be someone else's. The garden outside, which had once been overgrown and wild, now seemed less like a forgotten place and more like a space for new beginnings. The flowers bloomed once more, their petals catching the light of a new day. The air felt fresher, the land more alive, as though the curse had not only been lifted from the house, but from the earth itself. But despite all of this, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within me. The journey I had taken through the Maddox family's history, through their pain and their curse, had altered something deep inside. I could feel it in my bones, the connection between me and this place, this house, these walls, this legacy. It would stay with me forever. The Maddox family was gone, their curse broken, but I knew I would never forget what I had uncovered here. And, perhaps, the most haunting realization of all was this: there was always another story waiting to be told, another secret buried in the shadows of the past.